Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Mr. Samoluk, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show. Would you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Robbie, pleasure is mine to be joining you again. I am Tom Samoluk. I'm the former deputy director of the Assassination Records Review Board.
Now, recently we had the JFK hearings. This has to be weird for you or interesting for you just to see all of this kind of spark back up in popularity. I mean, it's been a few years, and for me, it's the first time that I've really ever had like a JFK hearing in my lifetime. I guess not until the ARB was actually created. I think was the last time that we had something of public attention and, Congress people actually speaking about it. I mean, how is it for you? I recently saw you get interviewed, I think by Rep Luna or someone for Fox or someone like that. And I was smiling because I was like, hey, I was talking to him not too long ago.
You're right, Robbie. It is definitely a new chapter of focus on the assassination more than 61 years after it happened. And for me, because I have literally followed this since I was a kid and remember the day that the president was shot. And when the memorial books came out, my older sister in particular followed the career of John F. Kennedy from the time that he was a member of the House of Representatives from Massachusetts and had scrapbooks, which he still has about his career. And then there was the tragic day, November 22nd, 1963, and everything that happened subsequently, including the House Select Committee on Assassination Investigation. And then, of course, 20 plus years later, the work of the review board, which I was honored to be a part of. So, yes, this is a new chapter of interest. I think that the release of the records, I've always said that is really important. I don't think that we'll come up with any answers. Unfortunately, I think the answers were largely lost to history. But nevertheless, I have always accompanied that statement with the statement that the release of the records was important to allow the American public, those who are interested, to look at the history of the assassination and the history around the assassination. And now, with the release of the records, the history is much more enriched and more robust for those to research it who care about it.
Before I get into some more serious, in depth questions for researchers listening out there, I wanted to ask your opinion on just the fact that something 61, 62 years later, we're going up on, it seems like there's a lot of interest still into the case as much as it was at when it happened. For the first time, I think I'm seeing a lot of my generation now interested in the matter of discussion now that after that hearing happened. I did not have a strong feeling of happiness when the hearing was occurring. I'll save that for some little bit questions later, but is it surprising to you to know that the public is still interested in the work that the HSCA did, the Assassination Records Review Board, and other things?
Well, we had always hoped that the work would be recognized as an addition to the history of not only the assassination, but the history of this country. And so to know that people are looking at the records is really important to me, both personally and professionally. I think it's important. Our history is important. And now, if you look back at what the review board law, the law that created the review board and the JFK assassination record collection said, the recent release is ensuring that the law is followed. They should have been released back in 2017. They weren't. There has been a slow process since then. Now we have these records that are available to the American public, and I call that bucket number one. But Robbie, you would probably agree that another bucket is those 2,400 FBI records that were discovered apparently once the president signed the executive order and the FBI was looking at what they were responsible for releasing and found these additional records. Now, as far as I know, those 2,400 records were not seen by the review board and staff. So that's bucket number two. Bucket number three is kind of everything else that you or other researchers, historians, or authors think would be important to add to the collection. And I know a lot of very competent people who have looked and studied the assassination have their wish list of additional records that should be released. And on some of them that I'm aware of that the review board didn't see, I can't say I disagree that there are more records I think that would add to the history surrounding the assassination.
The question on that about more records or potential records, do we honestly know? Because wasn't it from your own experience? Was it the Cooper film was one of the ones that you went and picked up, and you told us about how you slept with it under your pillow and you had it in the sink when you were. I mean, there's a lot of things that we don't know about until someone comes forward saying they have these records in the basement or garage or just old stuff like that. I think everyone thought there was only like 6,000 records to be released, is what the researchers were debating. And then we find out 2,000 something that were hidden away by the FBI or recently found. And then next, Trump's releasing 80,000. Now, a lot of them were already previously released by the Biden administration. I had already come across like the Underhill thing that sparked up in controversy again. But we don't really have an estimate on how many files were created. We just have a speculated number. It seems like it's changing all the time. I mean, do you think that there's going to be more revelations or just other files that we haven't been able to find because we just don't know it exists?
I think it's always a possibility that there will be more records that could be found either in the government's hands or you pointed out the Cooper film that there could be photos, records, films that are in private hands that are discovered years later by a family member. And we always thought when the review board was in operation from 1994 to 1998, you can't really know what you don't know. In other words, were there records that were lost or destroyed before the review board was in existence? It's always a possibility, but there's no way of really knowing. We just knew that there was a body of records that would exist. Some of them were declassified before the review board started its work, because some of the federal agencies had begun the process before we were actually up and operating. And then, of course, the definition of an assassination record had to be established by the review board, and the parameters increased. The Northwood documents, for example, were quite an addition to the collection, not directly relating to what happened on November 22nd, 1963, but certainly making the history around the assassination more robust. What was going on? What was the environment? What was going on with Cuba? What was going on within the U.S. government? All of those questions we thought were relevant to kind of dictate how broad the definition of an assassination record should be.
Now, were you aware when the ARB closed down that the National Archives had kind of taken over the mantle or probably taken over the responsibility when it came to record releases? It was hard watching that hearing because I get the guy's perspective about social security numbers. I understand that. But there didn't seem a lot. I don't know. To me, it just seemed like he wasn't as interested as opening up records, where I started to wonder what the current processing would be. I mean, if they took over your guy's mantle, that was the first I'd ever heard of that. I was like, wait, so we can still be having files that should be looked at and constantly released? I mean, there's so much online I've noticed, the HSCA videos, photos, just certain things that aren't released because it just hasn't been digitized yet. And that's a long process for researchers to make it down to College Park or whatever to disclose or get into this. I just went to DC and was like, oh, I'm not even at the right archives. I got to go to a whole other one in College Park, which is, it's complicated. We don't all have the ability to travel down there. So digitization of the audio footage, Frank Sturgis tapes I saw get released that is not online, but apparently they were released in this recent release of records. That's stuff that's like really, really important and could be crucial, but we don't have a digitized version.
Well, the volume of records is beyond belief because it seemed like virtually every federal agency had records. And then you also, if you think about it, beyond the federal records, There were records in New Orleans, the Garrison prosecution records that we added to the collection. There's just a whole range of records that add to the story. Specifically to your question, Robbie, about what was the responsibility of the National Archives after the review board no longer existed. I always thought that they had a tough task to pick up the mantle, so to speak, from the review board, because there were situations where we redacted documents, names in documents, CIA documents, that the CIA had said, if you release this document in total and reveal the name of a particular individual, then that individual's life would be in danger because he retired overseas undercover. And in the mid-90s, they were confident that adversarial governments around the world would be looking at what was released by the review board, and that could endanger people's lives. So what do? You say the records are the redacted portions are kept closed until the death of the individual or 25 years from the signing of the law that created the review board in the collection, which would have been October 26, 2017. But that's a lot for the National Archives to be able to chronicle what are the important dates where things are supposed to be released. So I think it's a tall order, but I understand your point that it doesn't make life easier for researchers who are interested in all of the new records, and the records that were released under the executive order. From what I hear, and I actually looked at some of them online, not the easiest organization of documents, or perhaps better put, there was no organization of the documents that were released. So kind of looking for a needle in a haystack. But hopefully that will improve with time, as people, and some of it may be left to researchers to organize what was released.
I think for one thing that interested me was that when they mentioned the social security numbers of people that were exposed or shown out there, I didn't think about that because throughout many conversations, I think everyone's name that would have been redacted is probably not around any longer. So I didn't think that was a crucial issue, but I understand if there was someone's name that happened to be mentioned and it happened to have some information on there, I get that 100%. And it's stuff we can overlook as researchers because we want those documents so bad. But the process that just seemed to be at a slow pace, if at all, stopped when it came to the National Archives job or archivist job of releasing these things was a big concern for me, because I think for years you can see that there wasn't drops or there was a minimal amount. And it seemed like we didn't have anybody that was dedicated as much as the Assassination Records Review Board was to just specifically analyzing these and releasing a certain amount per year. It seemed like it was kind of a task that was left up to them, but they didn't feel pressured enough to focus on that. Maybe because the hype behind the JFK assassination had started dropping back down. I mean, it was a niche topic. It's still a niche topic for people researching it 60 something years later. But for just your perspective from the Assassination Review Board's angle, did you think that this should have been something that when your board closed down, that there should have been, if they're going to continue or look at files and see what could be released, that there should have been a dedicated person in analyzing those and distributing them out over a year? I mean, we can't really examine the excuse that they haven't really focused as much.
Yeah, as far as when the review board shut the lights out on September 30th, 1998, and really it left the National Archives as the keeper of the records, and the torch was passed to them, so to speak. But I always wondered, given the limited resources that they have, how that was going to be accomplished. And what you're telling me, that it wasn't accomplished. But now I hope that since it's been recognized that those records that kind of fell out of the mainstream, but are still there to be processed, hopefully there will be resources to add those to the collection, get them online, so it will be easier for researchers like you and so many others to fit all the pieces of the puzzle together.
Now, did you happen to watch a lot of the JFK hearing, or did you watch it all? Did you have any opinions or thoughts? I mean, I think we're looking at obviously a whole different time period in how we've developed since the last hearing or the establishment of the Assassination Records Review Board. This one, to me, I have some strong opinions on, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on it first.
Yeah, well, the first thing is the fact that there's actually a congressional hearing on the JFK assassination going on in 2025 is kind of amazing. I mean, if you, from the date of the assassination, 1963, went back 61 years, you're talking about 1902, which seems like so long ago. But if you fast forward from 63 to 2025, it's the same amount of time, and it's literally 6+ decades. So the fact that there was a hearing, as amazing as it was, to me, it kind of validates the work of the review board and the House Select Committee and everybody that's been interested. This is part of our history. This is the death, the assassination of a president on the streets of America. I mean, that's pretty heavy. And to have, after all these years, so many questions still surrounding it, we should focus attention on it. Why? Because it happened and we don't want it to happen again. So to your question of what I watched of the hearing, I'm not all the way through the hearing. I do know Jefferson Morley and Jim DiEugenio, and met with Oliver Stone a couple of times and was interviewed for his, I think it was a 2021, or maybe we actually did the interview in 2019. Both Judge Thunheim, chair of the review board, and myself were interviewed at the same time by Oliver Stone. So I was naturally interested because of the movie, what he had to say. So I'm not completely through all the Q&A, but very impressed that there was a hearing to keep it kind of in the public eye. Now we need action. We need focused action on making that record around the assassination as robust and rich as possible.
Before I ask about the action part or maybe some suggestions you might have, I want to ask about when it came to the modern day politics of the time of 97 or from 93 to 97, did you feel at all any pressure of the modern day politics involved into what you had just stated about the death of a president? Because that JFK hearing immediately went into Epstein talk and immediately went into a couple of other things by certain representatives on the board. And if anybody knows any of the researchers or the ones that were speaking at that hearing, you would have never thought, and a lot of people don't think, a lot of people that look at the case, they call it a right-wing conspiracy or they don't want to touch it. It's a little bit more than that. It's about analyzing our history and where corruption was exposed. But a lot of researchers are either liberal or they're democratic in some sense. They're not right-wing. And Morley had some statements after one of the representatives had mentioned the Epstein stuff that he didn't want to get dragged into modern day politics. And that's kind of what I was getting out of it, which scared me, which I kind of wondered if that was like that back when the ARB was in stock, when you were doing your work. Were you dealing with people that were shoving more modern day political issues? It seemed like this was turning into a political chess piece, which kind of scared me. I think Thunheim mentioned it when he talked about Trump's statement about if you saw what I saw, you wouldn't release them either. It's becoming a modern day political like moving chip, and that's kind of not where I want it to be. I would like this to be taken seriously. We're at a JFK hearing, and the woman states, "I'm not here to talk about conspiracies." It's like, no, we're here to talk about JFK and the fact that we have a lot of evidence to support certain conclusions or certain estimates of a cover up, and you're not going to give us the time to talk about it.
Well, going back to the era in the mid 90s when the review board was in existence, I have no recollection of politics in any way interfering with the work that we were doing. It was really apolitical in my view. We had a task to make records available to the American public, ship them up to College Park, where you just were. And we were pretty focused on doing just that. I remember that originally the review board was supposed to be in existence for 2 years. It took a while for the review board to get up and running, get staff on board. And then we had to go up to Capitol Hill a couple times about funding for the additional year. So I remember going up with the first executive director, David Marwell, and we went up and we talked to the relevant committee staff about getting additional funding, and they understood that the funding hadn't been available right away when after the JFK Act had passed. So we went up, but that was all about funding. That was not about politics. I remember Judge Thunheim testifying before, must have been Appropriations Subcommittee. And I remember Congressman Stokes being at the hearing, and we got to talk to him beforehand because he was on appropriations. And of course, he was chair of the House Select Committee on Assassination. So he had an interest, but it was really about history and getting the records done, and where was the board in the process when we had that hearing that I'm thinking about. It wasn't about politics. It was about history.
What did you think about? I mean, how many members of the HSCA have you met? Was it just Stokes? Did you happen to meet Edgar? Did you meet Dodd? I think Dodd's still alive.
I only met Congressman Stokes, and as a high school student, I had written a letter to him. So at 17 years old, maybe during the House Select Committee being in operations, I had sent a letter to the chairman saying how important I thought their work was. And one night, working during the mid-90s when I was working for the review board, a colleague came into my office late one night, and he said, does this look familiar? And he had been going through the HSCA records, and that included correspondence that the HSCA had received. And sure enough, he was handing me my letter that I had written as a 17-year-old to Congressman Stokes. So when we were talking to him that day of the hearing about the work of the review board, I noted that I had sent him a letter as a high school student, and he feigned being really serious, and he said, "I hope I responded." And I assured him that he had responded to me. But just that little story in and of itself shows you that the history is real. People have cared about this tragedy for a long time. And you, as a younger researcher, party of interest, should have the resources that you need to kind of be the next generation that looks at this and maybe fill in some of the gaps. Not that everybody is going to agree as far as the conclusions about what happened, but at least we can make the record as robust as possible.
Now, when it comes to the gap or I guess the generational difference, do you think that if we had another hearing, if we still have to deal with this a couple of years later, from let's say 2030, 2035, do you think that it's just only going to get a little bit more disconnected, like I said, with the modern political issues? It seems like a lot of focus in the hearing was, okay, we know the CIA or FBI is suspected of being responsible, I think one of the women said, but she was like, I don't want to talk about how it was in the 60s. What about stuff we're dealing with now with them? And it's like, yeah, we have Secret Service destroying documentation like the ARB had to deal with as well, too. We have that still being a problem. My issue is that I want to make sure it doesn't lose the historical context. And sadly, when I'm looking at the HSCA stuff, those guys are generally interested in asking very informed questions, despite whatever anybody's belief is on the HSCA. Stokes asked Marina hard-hitting questions. They're really trying to get down to the root of it. They covered their bases when it came to the Umbrella Man. Stokes even said, somebody's got to open it up, and you got to make sure it's opened up, because then people will give us criticism if we don't open it up. As silly as they took it, as they laughed, which I wish they didn't do, but I understand how it seems in the situation. But they did their job. They generally were invested and cared about getting to the truth or just wanting to know for their own curiosity, much like I'm sure you were like when you were on the Assassination Records Review Board and still are now, keeping up with it so many years later.
Right. And I remember talking to some of the HSCA staff, names that you would recognize. And years later, when we were talking to them, so if they went out of business in 1979 with the completion of their final report, so we're talking to them, what, 95, 96, maybe into 97. So 16, 17, 18 years later. And I assure you, Robbie, memories do fade over time. We've all moved on to do other things while still maintaining the interest in the case. But I think you're right that the integrity of the case and the history and the records and accessibility to the records can get caught up in other modern day politics. And that's unfortunate. There's a forum for that. I don't think needs to be integrated into a discussion around the records. To your other question about, do I think that a hearing 5 years from now in 2030 means that we're more disconnected from the assassination? I think inherently we are. And I think that it gets more difficult with each year, with each month, with each day, with each minute, because the clock ticks and we lose people and memories fade. So that's why the current focus, if it's on the records, and I give credit to all those who are focused on the records and the history, then that's to our advantage while we seize the moment right now. It's a recognition of the importance of the event in our history. Not to say that what's currently going on isn't important. Of course it is, but history has always been a building block for our country. Just go back to the founding fathers and beyond. We preserve that history, and that's important.
Now, I was surprised I didn't see you in the JFK hearing. Did anybody bother to contact you? Or I know you had done an interview about some of the JFK files and the hearing coming up. I think it was before. I don't think it was after. But did you get contacted by anyone to show up and just maybe give some informed opinion on what the ARB had to deal with and what could be proper forms of action moving forward?
I did not get contacted, but I actually thought that Judge Thunheim, and I haven't talked to him since the hearing, I thought that he should have been contacted and would have added some important context in addition to the other witnesses. So I don't know whether he was asked or not, but I thought that Judge Thunheim would have been an additional value-added witness.
Do you think there was a reason why they didn't bother contacting you, just because maybe they were just trying to get the hearing over with? Like I said, a lot of it was pretty fast paced, and I'm sure they have other things. You can hear it back in when the HSCA was doing their work, many Congress people leaving because of bills being passed on the Senate floor or something like that. But it just seemed like there was a revolving door at that hearing, and I was kind of hoping. I think the best person I saw was a congressman that bothered to give his time to Oliver Stone and Jim DiEugene just to say what they wanted to say. And they did a good job disclaiming some things, not things I would have probably tackled because it's a little bit long and confounded. But I mean, do you find that like it just was something that was you guys just kind of didn't get contacted because there's probably a revolving door of politics and other things that were going on that might have been on their minds?
Yeah, it's a good question. You're motivating me to send a message to Judge Thunheim to see if in fact he was contacted. I mean, the value to me would be that we are the last dedicated board or commission to the assassination, although, as you well know, our mandate was not to draw a conclusion as to who killed the president. It was to release the records. Nevertheless, in some respects, Gaten Fonzie, whose book, The Final Investigation, was not accurate. Little did he know that 16, 18 years later, there would be another body, that is the Assassination Records Review Board, not investigating, so to speak, although we did some investigating because I think that the review board pressed the limits, pushed the envelope, so to speak, on records related to the medical side of the case, and also pursuing some that I was involved in having to do with New Orleans and the Garrison records, and going to Dallas and trying to get some publicity, Judge Thunheim and I, when we made the media rounds in Dallas. And that's when the Cooper film came out. We, as I think I mentioned one of the times that I've appeared with you before, Robbie, meeting with Dave Powers, finding what had happened with the Powers film. So there are a lot of things that we did that maybe would have been relevant today to making sure that everything that is relevant could be found.
Before we get to the suggested kind of approaches that you might have had if you were at that hearing and things that we should go with moving forward, obviously digitization is one of those, but I want to go back to the Garrison aspect. There were some files that maybe you've come across, maybe you haven't. It was released that had Garrison's name involved into it. A couple things were dealing with memos with the NBC and certain media heads that seemed like they were doing a more targeted approach at Garrison. I don't know what everyone's opinion is on Garrison, but from your work looking at the New Orleans aspect of things, I mean, how difficult was that to navigate with the whole Garrison aspect? Because any researcher knows it's a very controversial area depending on where you sit on the fence. Most like everything in the JFK assassination is pretty controversial. But the Garrison files, there's a lot of things that we are missing. There's certain aspects of things that we just don't have background on because either a memo was sent, we only got one of the two. So I'm curious, how interesting or difficult was it to navigate the whole New Orleans aspect of the case? It is a often overlooked spot as compared to Mexico City or right in the heart of Dallas.
Right. One thing I remember going to New Orleans quite a bit while the review board was in operation is that if during the course of one's day, if people found out what you were doing, everybody had an opinion. Everybody had an opinion on the JFK assassination, the Garrison investigation, Lee Harvey Oswald, and that made it for a very interesting existence when we were in New Orleans. You had all these side battles. I mean, not only was there the fundamental question about was the Clay Shaw prosecution a legitimate one? Was he dogged by this prosecution wrongfully? You had the very basics about the case, but then you had Garrison versus Harry Connick, because Harry Connick succeeded Jim Garrison as DA and did not like Garrison at all. He pulled no punches on that when we were in his office. And I remember it like it was yesterday with him talking about Jim Garrison and the investigation. We did the best we could getting the records that were grand jury records that were part of the Garrison investigation. You may recall there was controversy about that because an investigator heard then District Attorney Connick during our AARB hearing say that that basically the Garrison people pilfered the files, took all the records. Well, this one investigator knew that not to be true because Connick had told him to burn the grand jury proceeding, which the investigator did not do. He kept them for 20 years and then gave them to a New Orleans TV reporter who then caught District Attorney Connick off guard and said, when Connick repeated that the Garrison people had taken files, which may or may not have been true, I don't know. But one of the things that was true was that there were records that did not remain in the Connick office because the investigator chose not to bring him to the city incinerator. He took them home, and then they ended up in the review board's hands and are now at the National Archives. And that ended up in litigation that dragged out, Robbie, you may recall, for over a year, is my recollection. And the Harry Connick tried to get right up to the Supreme Court, tried to get the Supreme Court to hear the case against us. because he wanted those records back, and the Supreme Court chose not to hear the case. So we had those records that had been sent to us by the TV reporter, and then there were additional records that Connick had admitted were in the DA's office. But once we started the dispute over the records that the investigator had kept, he did not send those additional records to us until the case had died, when the Supreme Court chose not to hear the matter. So we're like any aspect, any chapter of the case. Did people take other records home? Were they destroyed? Were they lost? Yeah, probably. I mean, I went through the help of another New Orleans reporter. I ended up going to see friends of Clay Shaw, as Clay Shaw was long deceased, but there were a few boxes of records, if I recall correctly, that had passed down through the hands of Clay Shaw's friends after he died. And I ended up with them with at the time, whatever year that was, 96 or 97, the then keeper of the Clay Shaw files. They agreed to turn them over to me, and those went to the National Archives too. And that included, as I recall, a diary kept by Clay Shaw, which has been written about, but to have the original and to feel and to actually smell the musty documents that had been kept for at that point since 1967. I think Clay Shaw passed away maybe in 1974. So the records had been passed down. We tried to get other records from other players in New Orleans and in Dallas, and the clock is always ticking. We did the best we could. We added to the National Archives collection, but who knows what else is out there and still could be revealed, whether it will be anything that's still out there, any photo, film, or document will be definitive and once and for all prove what happened. The odds are against that. Do I think those records are important to get into the collection? Absolutely.
Do you remember if it was David Atlee Phillips that was in those files, that the ones that were taken back and not destroyed, or was it the one that Dick Russell talks about?
I don't. I know who David Atlee Phillips is. I don't recall the specifics of those files.
Okay. What would you consider a plan of attack here when it came to what the hearings should have led to an outcome with? Obviously, we can sit here and wait for more releasing of files. I think a lot of people are doing that right now, and then also sifting through the ones that we have. But what can be better forms? We had mentioned digitization. Have you had any thoughts about things that could make this more easily accessible to the public, or steps at least moving forward? I think you were one of like the communication people for the Assassination Records Review Board. I mean, obviously putting a memo out there for anyone that would be tuning in using either online sources or just watching TV to be able to bring in any documentation that they might have or a copy. You know, a lot more people I feel like would be hesitant, or not as hesitant as they were back in the day, to hand over their only footage, considering that we have so many sources now where I'm sure anybody that has documentation and still cares about the case can just copy it and then be more than happy to send in a copy to us, just so we can see what they have without them feeling like it's going to get destroyed or they're never going to get it back. Because I'm sure, you know, through looking at a lot of those memos from back in '63 and so on, people's films were confiscated and never given back. Whether it was just a small thing on it or whether it was just got lost in the ether, I don't know. But that only inflates the concern of other people that might still have documentation out there.
Right. And even 30 years ago, when the review board was in operation, I remember going to Dallas to get the Cooper film and dealing with those folks. And throughout our time, you remember, I think I talked about going out to California after the death of Richard Case Nagel. And there was a fear, and I wish I could say it had gotten better. There was a fear and a cynicism about the federal government. It's probably gotten worse because I think the public's trust in the federal government has continued to decline since the review board was in operation. But it was not surprising to hear people express fear and cynicism about what we were doing. And we kind of had to win them over that we're functioning under the law signed by George H.W. Bush on October 26, 1992. Our goal is to be respectful of people, to be public and transparent about what we're doing, but to add to the record. So I think that the fact that today, in 2025, you had a recent congressional hearing is very important. Congressional oversight is important. And I think that you've pointed out that the National Archives may have fallen behind on the process that was expected after the review board went out of business. And I don't know details about that, but I think that there should be resources to do that. Resources for anything are difficult these days. And there's probably people that would say, we can't afford to do all that researchers would like to see done to bring these records closer to people around the country online. But I think you struck on something, Robbie, and that is the advances in technology. And I would point specifically to the use of AI. I'm just wondering, and I'm no expert on AI, whether or not there are uses of AI, if you could get people to focus on how can that advanced technology help speed up that which needs to happen with all the records. And what needs to happen is to make them more readily available to people online. And so they don't have to go in person to College Park. I mean, I understand that the volume is an issue here. There's just so many documents and photos and film, but it doesn't mean that we stop working on it. So I would hope that there would be another congressional hearing and it be focused on the records. It pivot off of what the review board did, what was supposed to happen, what's happening with the new records that have been released. And I say new records, if you go back to what I said earlier, remember, bucket number one are the records that the review board reviewed. 90-something% of them were released, but the records that were recently released, other than the 2,400 FBI records, all those records were seen by the review board and staff. We just didn't feel under the law that we could release them at the time. So there's an ongoing process, but it takes resources, and resources are tough. But congressional interest, congressional oversight would be a good place to kind of keep an eye on what's happening with the records.
What about the ARB's final determination notices? Maybe you can, if you know about them, could you maybe educate my audience a little bit more about these declassification things that were supposed to be dated, of these things were supposed to be released to the public? This was the final determination on this. Andrew Eiler had just found those recently, I think a couple months ago, and was interviewed about those. I talked to him about it. I had no idea because this was never brought up in any of the discussions I had with either Mr. Tunheim or anything. And I don't know if you guys just forgot or didn't think it was like important or something. I mean, you guys went through so much, it's only expected.
Like I said, memories do fade. I remember when those documents were being created and they were going to be put to use for when the review board was no longer in existence. So I think review of what happened to those documents, kind of a checklist of what has been released, what was supposed to be released, what hasn't been released, that could be part of a congressional oversight hearing. Just kind of a scorecard on where are we on all that was supposed to happen after the review board was in existence. Now, of course, a big step was the recent document dump, which bucket number one are the review board records. But does that mean that everything did they capture everything, I guess is the question that I would ask rhetorically, and I don't know the answer to that.
Who would you establish as people that could be informed on the subject to be a part of a committee that would be holding another hearing? I think my biggest problem with the last hearing is that there wasn't a lot of informed people that were asking questions. A big one everyone knows about is questioning Oliver Stone, and then she was thinking Roger Stone and not Oliver, which was a big issue. But there's obviously not a lot of informed people on the case, which is okay because, again, it's not a modern day political issue. I was just wondering, should we establish members like Tunheim, yourself, others that have seen files, know what to talk about, know where to look, where to disclose? I'm sure Jeremy Gunn more than happy to come back out of nowhere to be able to talk to us about it or be able to help find some answers. Like you had mentioned about the medical evidence and the questioning. You guys didn't know that Jeremy Gunn could go in that direction and start asking hard-hitting questions like that and becoming more of an not an interrogation, but a serious question-based thing. And we got some very revealing stuff, and it's on audio tape as well, too, on some of it at least. So I'm wondering what you would consider for reliable sources and reliable people that would be a part of another hearing that would be investigating and looking and trying to get the public's attention on some serious issues within the case.
Well, a couple of things. I know that there is the special committee that conducted the hearing, chaired by Congresswoman Luna. But I'm kind of a traditionalist. There are established existing committees in the Congress that are responsible for oversight of the National Archives. You have your authorization committee, you have your appropriation committee. And so that is an existing structure that on an ongoing basis, because the National Archives has to go before the Congress at least once a year for authorization and appropriation. And I think that this questions about the JFK collection could be integrated into that process. I don't think that, and certainly those of us who were involved in the review board would add what we could. It's been a long time. There are people at the National Archives who are currently responsible for the collection. They would probably be more adept and more up to speed on what's going on. And they can also talk about what resources would be needed. Resources are a tough topic because you only need to read the paper about cutbacks that are going on. And I don't know specifically how that has impacted the National Archives, but nevertheless, they're the ones responsible for the collection. So they could give an update on what's going. And it's not about finger pointing. It's just about finding out where we are in the process and the follow-up to the review board.
Now, we've talked about it before, and I think everybody's kind of pressured you on it before about you writing your own book. But I wanted to ask, have you ever had just one day where you wake up and you have a recollection of something that you might have forgotten when it came to certain instances within the Assassination Records Review Board? And are you writing those down when you do?
I have, I think I might have mentioned to you on the 40th anniversary, I wrote, which would have been obviously 2013, I wrote a 3,000 word article for Boston Magazine that kind of chronicled my personal experiences. Some of the stories in there you've heard, Robbie, and are familiar with. I do, keep notes of what happened. I don't have any great revelations that I didn't already remember and already think were important. I may have mentioned that after I wrote that Boston Magazine article, the editor of Boston Magazine asked me if I was interested in turning that into a book. And I said, well, I'm open to any kind of discussion. It had happened to other authors of Boston Magazine articles shortly before my article was published in November 2013. I actually did talk to a book agent, and it's kind of, given our earlier conversation, it's kind of coincidental that I'll mention this. There was some interest. I can't say it was overwhelming interest, but they were interested in what I had put in Boston Magazine. That started out as maybe 10,000 words, and I had to get it down to 3,000, which was my limit. And they said there was some interest. I remember the person I talked to out of New York. I also saw fairly recently this individual, a well-known book agent, is now deceased. But what he told me was that they were talking to Harry Connick Sr., not about an autobiography, but about his cooperation with an author that was with this agent, a biography about Harry Connick, and they wanted Connick to cooperate. So I was told now's probably not a good time for us to be working with you because that's a project that's already underway. I don't even know whatever happened. We could probably both look online and see if there are biographies of Harry Connick Sr. This would have been, as I said, 2013, so it would have been sometime after that if a biography ever did come out about him. So life catches up with you, Robbie. You move on, and it's a very interesting chapter for me in my life, and the people like Judge Thunheim that I met, and fellow staffers and the other review board members it's a cherished time for me. We had a serious task, but that doesn't mean that you don't cherish the people that you work with and relied on and respected. So I take opportunities like this to talk about that. I think the records are important, but I don't see a book in the offing. If I had the answer to the question that is the big question, then maybe I'd be more inclined to write a book. But I just enjoy talking to you and others who are interested in history, are interested in establishing as firm a record as possible.
You don't need a book. You need a movie deal, and Matt Damon will play you. I'd sign up for that.
He is a local guy, so there's some symmetry to that.
One last question for you here, and it's just, could you possibly just give my audience and anybody that would be new to the JFK case out there, I guess, just some good thoughts moving forward in the direction of keeping the historical record alive, but at the same time, and obviously anyone new to this case is coming against a whole bunch of information from various theories and things like that. But we don't want to distract from the main point that John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November 22nd, 1963. And we have to understand the full events and the story behind it and why transparency is so important.
Yeah, that's a good opening for me, Robbie. I would say that if you care about history, if you care about the foundation, as I said earlier, the building blocks for the nation, the ongoing phenomenon of history is really important. It is the structure in which we live and function as a democracy today. So I think that those of your age and even younger, and I have two daughters who are younger than you, and they have expressed interest in contemporary U.S. history, in the JFK assassination as part of that. You can't get around it. I mean, the world changed on that day, and the world, I believe, was changing prior to that day with the Kennedy administration. You go back and you listen to the peace speech and the moon speech, and you see the relevance to the president's words to today and what he was trying to do. And it was all cut short in a flash. How that happened, like I said, maybe lost to history, but the history is important. And we made mistakes as a nation in the aftermath of the assassination from the get-go. There are things that we cannot undo that happened. They're unfortunate. So we deal with what we have today. That is a history that is as best, hopefully, as we can do. And people should be heard. People should write to their congressman like I did. Not only did I write to Senator or Congressman Stokes, another letter that we uncovered in the files was a letter that I had written 2 or 3 years before I wrote to Congressman Stokes. I wrote to Senator Edward M. Kennedy from Massachusetts. And that was a letter that we also found in our works. And here, all these years later, letters that I wrote in high school are part of the historical record as I talk to you, as just one American who was interested. So hopefully there are a lot of other people that are interested in the history. And it doesn't mean that we want to be stuck in time, but we don't want to ignore the foundation, the history, one of the building blocks, and learn from it about today and going forward. This is a very difficult and complicated world. And so understanding history is to me really important. And your generation and beyond that can be a part of firming up the foundation, if you will.
Mr. Samoluk, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show and the many conversations we've had on the subject matter and also your personal experience on it. I'm going to link your contact information in the description below for people to be able to see, or anything that we used for the last episode as well too will be linked in the description. I appreciate the time, and hopefully we get to chat again soon. I'd like to set something up with Tunheim again. But thank you everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blanket. Stay tuned for our next episode.